term that's used very widely these days is phishing resistant, and I think that's a good term. I've worked in security for about 20 years, and if I ever claimed something was completely secure, I'm lying. There is no such thing as absolute security. It's a journey between less secure and more secure. So that's why the term phishing resistant is used. It's how resistant can you be against a phishing attack? And to understand what phishing resistance is, it's worth trying to explore some of the techniques people use for phishing, and then you can look at how you protect yourself against them. So the very lowest level, the weakest form of protection out there is a simple password. It can get reused, it can get stolen, it's a very easy thing to phish. Once you've got that, you can be that person. So if I say I'm logging onto a particular website and it's asking me for my password, if it says, oh, you've entered it incorrectly, please re-enter that password, I might easily fall for that and just re-enter it. But at that point, I'm no longer on the genuine site. I've been taken off to another site and I've provided them my password. So that's easily done. So that's a very weak form of protection. So what most people do is to try and step up to two-factor or stronger authentication. So a password is just a single factor. Once I have that factor, I can be that person. So it's easy to phish. Stronger authentication tends to involve two factors. So perhaps something I have, my phone, and something I am, my fingerprint, or something I know, a PIN. And I need both of those factors to be able to identify myself as that person. So that starts to become more phishing resistant than a simple password. One of the challenges are there are very few standards around credentials and digital identity that you can look to. So organizations will be looking at, I need to be more secure, but what's secure? What is secure? One of the elements out there is published by NIST, who set the standards in the US, a standard called FIPS 201, subtitled PIV, Personal Identity Verification. So that sets a standard for how do we identify government employees, and it's also spread out to suppliers and contractors into US government. And this is one of the very few published standards out there. Was recently updated to FIPS 201-3. Previous versions of the standard talked about PKI, smart cards, crypto-based, the absolute highest levels of assurance of phishing resistance. But then started to realise that that's actually quite complicated and expensive to deploy for some people. So let's try and move people away from passwords at the bottom, further up to higher levels of security, but accept the fact that they're not going to move all the way to the top, to that government military level of security. So what they did is they published guidance on what they call authentication assurance levels, with authentication assurance levels 3 at the very top, hardware-backed PKI, smart cards, cryptography, 1 down the bottom, passwords, but still some guidelines on how you should secure those, and then a range in the middle, sort of the more traditional one-time passwords that we've all used to log on to our bank. And what they stated is, depending on the level of information you're protecting, you need to use an appropriate level of security. And I think this is a very pragmatic approach. It happens in the real world. There's no way a bank could afford to deploy very high assurance credentials to all of their customers. It just wouldn't make commercial sense. There's no point for me to protect accessing my library account with a really, really high secure credential. But if I'm protecting military helicopter plans, tracking nuclear material, absolutely I need those at the highest level of protection. So this starts to give good guidelines for, depending on the level of data you're protecting, what is more secure and what is more phishing resistant. So starting down at the bottom end, passwords, not very phishing resistant, easy to steal once you have that one factor you're in. But again, there are guidelines there to make sure that your password is complicated, so it's not complex, so it's not easily guessed. And importantly, make sure that it's not known to be compromised. So even if I have a long and complex password, but that's been published onto the dark web in a breach for the Sony PlayStation or LinkedIn breach, for example, people can steal that and then they can log into my account. So there are rules around that. Next level up is starting to look at one-time passwords. So this is still a password, but it will live for about 10 or 15 minutes. So if you steal it, you can use it within that time, but you can't use it an hour later or the next day, for example. So it gives you a high level of protection. And they're often combined with a second factor of authentication, such as a PIN. So I will enter my one-time code or a PIN. Different levels of security and levels of phishing resistant on the different credential types. So if I'm sent a one-time code via an SMS message to my phone, that SMS network is not secure, it's not encrypted. There are known hacks against that network where people will steal those credentials and reuse them. That could be over the network, they could have malware on the phone. So that's less phishing resistant than other types of authentication, which I'll come on to. The other one there potentially is a SIM swap. So if you can take a SIM, put it in another phone and fool the network organization, the network provider, into saying, hey, that's my real phone, suddenly you can start getting those one-time codes. So the next level up, more secure than that, is where you start to use a hardware token or an app to actually generate that one-time code. So if you're sending a push notification to an app, for example, that will be an encrypted channel. So you can't get in the way and you can't steal that one-time code en route down to that device. And again, you can combine that with something such as a biometric. So I receive a push notification to my phone, I tap that, I put my fingerprint on the reader. Things bound to the person, fingerprints, generally a little harder to steal than pins or codes that people could guess, birth dates, etc. So there are levels of assurance as we move up. At the very highest, we have hardware-backed crypto phishing resistant. Not a very interesting term, try and explain what that means. So it's the concept of public-private key. So I have a private key generated on a device, a hardware device. That could be a USB token, it could be a smart card, and I have a public key. I can sign things with that private key. For example, somebody sends me a logon attempt, an authentication attempt. I can digitally sign that with my hardware device. The signature occurs on the hardware device, never leaves the device, so that can't be stolen or reused or compromised. I typically have to use a second factor to do that, such as a fingerprint, something I am, or a PIN, something I know. The way that's validated is with the public key. So I sometimes describe this as it's similar to having a photograph of somebody's signature. That's the public key. So I can validate their signature with it, but I can't actually create that signature. And that's the principle behind it. So I can digitally sign an authentication attempt with the private key on a piece of hardware, and I can validate with that public key. But that is a one-off, unique challenge response. So the next time I authenticate, it will be a completely different event, and I can't reuse that in 1 to 5 minutes time like I can with a one-time code. So there are different levels of phishing resistant, but the main story here is really there is no such thing as 100% secure. Have a look at what you're protecting, have a look at what works in your environment, and choose a level of authentication that best fits your needs.